And so I walked upstairs and just out of pure rage started blogging about why Generation Z would be a game changer.
The Phil Bach Podcast. Investing, economics, entrepreneurship.
All right, welcome back to the Phil Bach Podcast. We have a great show today. My guest is Julia Carreon. Julia is a leader in financial technology, innovation, and specifically Gen Z. She burst on the scene a few years ago with a blog post about Gen Z disruption and has led huge teams of Fortune 25 companies in the area specifically of wealth management as it relates to technology and innovation. Julia, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Happy to be here.
All right, I thought we'd start just from a high level and just talk about technology and innovation and what that means to you.
So, the most important thing I think to realize about technology today is that the internet has been around for 30 years. And so it's not new. And the idea that companies of every sector should have been leaning into digital omni-channel experiences a long time ago should not be new. And I'm fascinated by how many people were caught scrambling kind of with their pants down when COVID hit, trying to figure it all out as if it was a new thing. And it frankly isn't. So innovation should be part and parcel of every sector and every firm's DNA. And if it's not, they're doing it wrong.
It really is amazing because we've heard about this for so long and people are talking about for so long how automation is coming and technology is coming and the users are demanding better technology of legacy banks and wealth managers and asset managers and the like. And everyone, like you said, everyone saw this coming. Yet when we had the acceleration of technology due to COVID, it seemed like some firms were just in the right place at the right time. They were ready to really have their day in the sun, which is sad because, obviously it was a difficult time for so many people, but still from a business standpoint, we're prepared and ready for the opportunity. And others had no idea. I remember when all the offices started to get shut down and people were working remote, there were huge companies that just had no idea how to handle it. How is that possible? Why is it that the companies with the most resources, with the most foresight, why they were so slow to adapt?
So this is one of my favorite questions in the world because the answer, is not easy. And I have a little bit, I think, of a contrarian view to that. And it's simply that after the 2008 financial crisis, every company in every sector should have seen that generations were going to turn over and that the next generation coming up behind sort of Gen X was going to demand more seamless digital experiences. And so they should have absolutely been taking every single dime and figuring out their IT stacks and cleaning up all of their technical debt and leaning into omni-channel, right? There's no excuse for not having done it, except, and this is again, just a Julia theory that I have, in 2008, if you think about it, baby boomers and the silent generation largely had corporate control and they were going to retire, but because their portfolios were decimated, many couldn't retire, part of the normal cycle of generations cycling through the workplace. They held on to corporate power for longer than other previous generations. And they didn't have the same expectation and haptic memory, right? The general growing up and use of technology like Gen X and then, of course, millennials and Gen Z did. They did not see technology as an urgent fire drill back then. So I have, very strong convictions that we are a good 10 to 15 years behind in technology across kind of your traditional legacy sectors, healthcare, you see it in oil and gas, financial services, and there is a huge pent-up demand for getting through all of that now, that has created a sense of urgency, and especially, as you said, with COVID. So I think it has to do with, just what with, major events that were going on in the world at the time, and then that pushing off the normal generational turnover that would have happened. And then in financial services, we could talk about that more later, but then also, you had dumping of regulations onto everybody's back, right? Because financial services caused largely the '08 crisis. So people were kind of dealing with the regulatory situation and ignoring the digital situation. And I do think you have a really interesting, I call it a really interesting stew on our hands in terms of how to solve the problem now, right?
So there were two things there that I want to kind of go back over. And, something that you've written about is how change tends to happen slow, and then sudden, right? This slow crawl, and then all of a sudden something happens, an impetus, and it seems like it happens overnight. And something that you just mentioned in passing was a generational wealth transfer, that we are about to see the largest transfer of wealth that the world has ever seen with, as it passes down from the baby boomer generation. Do you think, with those two things, with those two ideas and concepts kind of coming together, do you think that the legacy players in financial services and banking are well suited to capture that generational wealth transfer, with the younger generations having a much higher importance on placing a much higher value on technology? Or do you think that they can just buy some of the startups and put things together last minute, and that they are going to be able to capture some of that coming demand?
So a lot to unpack there. I think that my whole thesis on Gen Z disruption is the idea that the younger generation would force disruption in a way that we hadn't seen heretofore. So I'm going to tell a story about 2017 and 2018. I was out on the road a lot talking about disruption in our business and making the case, I thought, for why firms should be doubling down on digital. And I was getting a lot of pushback about that. And the pushback was from executives who frankly should have known better, because they said, well, Julia, fintech hasn't taken any kind of material market share. And so why should we worry about the fact that they will now? And the reality is what we just said, right? Generations take 20 years to turn over. And since the inception of fintech, there hadn't been a huge flip of generations. And I've already said, I believe that the '08 crisis caused for a stalling of a normal generational turnover. And then you add in this idea of millennials being forever infantilized by the media and not having as much wealth as previous generations. And you've got a really interesting situation on your hands. So to go back to your question, I think what we saw with GameStop is the opening salvo for what I've been talking about for 5 years. And that is that Generation Z will uniquely force change in a way that perhaps Gen X and millennials were more okay with just letting you do business with your parents' banks. I don't think we'll see that with Gen Z. I have been saying that for 5 years, and I think we're seeing the beginning of it. But, the other interesting dynamic here is that if the big financial services firms, I call them captives, if they had been doing a better job at resonating with the younger generation in an authentic way from a very young age, I do think that they would have an easier chance. But then look, Phil, you've also got this really interesting situation where financial advisors are aging and the business is having a hard time recruiting the next generation of FA. So you've got people going out the back door, young people coming in the front door needing financial advice, and you have banks sitting in a position of not having the tools, I think, to appeal to them. I don't want to make it sound as dire as it does, so you need to save me here.
No, I think that's great. And I think what we're going to do here is we're going to Benjamin Button it. We're going to go backwards. So we're starting now and we're talking about these trends that you foresaw and that you've been talking about and, changes in the financial and wealth and banking sectors, right? But let's go back because you weren't always out there out front. You weren't always, you had this great TED Talk and, you wrote this explosive blog and burst on the scene. But before that, you were at a very large company. How did you get to a point where you went from the boardroom to, being able to put yourself out there? What was that like?
So in 2008, in the post-financial services crisis of '08, if you remember, everybody in the industry started chasing what? Robo. So everybody was in our business trying to create a new business model, chasing that in from my view, spending finite dollars to do digital projects, and people were chasing robo like banshees. And I really had strong feelings about that was the wrong path, and that we should actually be figuring out how to make the current revenue streams, right, that are really the lifeblood of our business, make those table stakes completely seamless in terms of customer experiences. So I raised a bunch of money internally to do 9 months of research. And I wrote a white paper that is called The Future of Advice. And we trademarked it. And it was my life's work, and I was super proud of it. And it was all about bringing advisors and clients together in a modern way that recognizes the fact that financial advisors are offering a value add that is incredibly important to all generations. And so we kind of bookmarked that and did that in maybe, I think we finished it in, let's just say the beginning of 2011. So fast forward to 2018, it was January 12th, and I was at a large industry event on a panel, and the panel had wrapped up, and a very senior person came to the microphone and gave credit for that, the future of advice, to a young person on the stage who was not even on the team when I wrote The Future of Advice. And it was a real wake-up call for me. It was, I had spent my career up until that point really believing that putting your head down and doing hard work and having the work speak for itself would get you the quote unquote credit or whatever that you needed to make a difference in the industry. And at that moment, it really struck me that I was not seen and I was not heard, and that the only way to be seen and to be heard was to make sure that you were in control of your own destiny. And so I'll just take a second to pause and say you and I met that way because I realized that if you weren't on social media, you didn't really exist in today's modern world. So I'm going to pause there in that story and just say I wouldn't have had a chance to meet people like you if I hadn't figured out that I needed to tell my story in my own way, and that social media was the mechanism to do that.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do social media when you're at a large company. You're not authorized to speak on behalf of the company, and it can be a dangerous thing. And I spent the early part of my career with bigger companies, like most people, and I was what I would now call like a behind the scenes person. That whole time, nobody knew who I was other than the people that I specifically worked with, and over time, slowly, I got to get out a little bit to go to conferences and to meet with clients and to meet people. But still, I was very limited to the people that I specifically interacted with. It was only when I left the large corporate world and did my first startup that I saw, first of all, how far behind I was. I thought I was ahead, but I wasn't. I was behind in terms of, being able to market, at the time it was ETFs, but whatever I was doing, being able to market it and reach a broader audience beyond my network. And it became clear to me that no one's going to sit there as my agent and talk about how great Phil Bach is, right? Just like nobody's going to sit there and talk about how great Julie is. Of course, you've got close relationships and you've got people that, know you and respect you, but you need to do your own self-promotion. And I think for most of us, we're all, I think I'm naturally, it might not come across on social media because of this, but I think I'm naturally humble and I'm not the braggadocious type, right? I'm not the type to put myself out there, but I've forced myself out of my comfort zone into that role because if I don't promote myself, nobody else will. Right. So you have to, in this day and age, if you want to do anything entrepreneurial, if you want to be known outside your network and to grow your audience in any way as part of your career, you have to an extent, be a little bit uncomfortable and be a little bit self-promotional and, not to the point where you're obnoxious and turning people off, but to the point where you're calling attention to what you're capable of and what you're about. It's just something that you have to do now to be able to grow. And I think it's something that you do quite well.
Well, thank you. I am new. So let's, I love to tell the truth about who I am and not be posturing. This is only the fourth podcast that I've recorded because to your point, I was not allowed to do podcasts. I was really not allowed to talk about the future of advice. And I have found social media to absolutely be game changing and to tell your story in a way that is authentic and, to your point, not arrogant, but also very genuine. I mean, you see and that I am in many ways a contrarian, and I am perfectly comfortable being a contrarian. So I would also say, if you have a unique perspective and you believe in it and you can defend it and you're willing to take hits for it, then there is absolutely no downside to social media. And so just to go back to that story, I was in that room. When I get really mad, I black out. In a very weird way, like it's a dark curtain that starts at the top of my head and goes all the way down to my feet. And it takes me a minute to recover. I was so furious. The meeting ended. It was a national meeting, but it happened to be in Houston, and we live in Austin. I let myself get in the car and drive home sobbing. So it's 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. There happened to be a blinding rainstorm that day, the kind of Texas rainstorm that a native Californian like me is not entirely used to. I would have to pull over to the side of the road because it was raining so hard and my tears were so big that I couldn't see. And I let myself fume all the way home. And by the time I got home, I was so mad and determined to do something about the narrative that I walked upstairs and I published my first blog on why financial services is running out of time to get their act together in terms of digital. And I knew, right, Phil, that what I did 8 years ago, which in many ways, unfortunately, the industry is so behind. In many ways, that's still relevant, but I didn't want to go back to that, right? In my mind, I have moved on. Like at this point now, I'm thinking about Generation Z. I'm thinking about your kids and my kids that are interacting and engaging in ways that you and I cannot actually really relate to. And so I walked upstairs and just out of pure rage started blogging about why Generation Z would be a game changer and why everybody was counting them out in a way that was actually putting the industry at peril. So I walked upstairs, I did that, and then I just started blogging about it and reaching out to people, industry experts, haptic memory experts, sociologists, and I kept doing my blog. And by April, I was contacted by Brandeis University to do a keynote speech on why Generation Z is consuming technology in different ways than other places for that November. And I was kind of off to the races at having a different brand, having a different perspective in the industry than anybody was really tackling. And I hope that inspires, someone who has an idea bouncing around in their head that they think maybe is silly or ridiculous, or, wow, I don't know anything about that because, God, I didn't know anything about Gen Z, and doing something about it because it really did kind of change the way I thought about myself, the way I thought about my future career. And really, I have very strong feelings that our kids shouldn't be left out of what's happening. And I think that our industry is offering services and adds value in a way that is so important and will be relevant always. But they've got to recognize that they have to start meeting these kids where they are, instead of assuming that the industry never has to change because we're just so big and bad, meaning big and awesome, not, big and bad evil, but big and bad awesome. And that things are just not going to evolve because we're wrong.
Yep. No, I agree with that. So we're going to keep moving backwards in time from the present back. And I want to go back to, you were a journalist and you won a Webby, right? It was one of the first Webbies, but you won a Webby as a journalist. How did you go from being a journalist to getting, so deep into the banking world and the technology world? What was that transition like?
So I was a journalist in San Francisco during the first .com, right before the first .com boom. And I was an editor at InfoWorld. And I was a writer and then editor at InfoWorld. And I came across a woman who was a very well-known, she was the president of a lot of visible things in San Francisco at the time. And she and I had lunch, and she told me that she used to be a journalist and that she left because she realized that you could make more money by not telling other people's stories, but by making your own story up. So I used my passion and ability to tell stories to talk my way into a job as a webmaster in South of Market, San Francisco in the early 2000s, and found myself at the age of 27 managing a bunch of HTML programmers. By the way, I'm laughing because I didn't realize until somebody looked at me cross-eyed, what the heck is a webmaster? I started managing HTML programmers at the age of 28 for a startup. And the funny story, which you and I have talked about before, which I love to share, is that I was in a meeting with our CEO and he declared that revenue no longer mattered. And it's so funny. So I remember being like, okay, well, I was not a math major, but that doesn't make sense to me. And I started kind of panicking. Like, you started seeing that VC money was drying up. Nobody was making any money. And I was smart enough and had enough, common sense to, before the first bust, I answered a Craigslist ad to go work for a real firm to stand up their first omni-channel home equity application to compete with LendingTree. And I took a big pay cut as a 30-year-old, which people were like, oh, that doesn't make sense. We're all still, in this overheated .com market where we can make money. That didn't make sense. I took a pay cut. I'm really proud of that. And got a real job because I really saw the crash coming. And within a year, the bust had happened. And all of these people who were probably technically smarter than me were out on the street looking for work. And there really wasn't that much work to be had.
Do you see any similarities between that, what you saw at the time ahead of the bust, and what we see today?
I absolutely do. And I'm cringing as I say it because I think that means I'm old. But, I feel like to deny that things happen in cycles is to deny reality, right? In '01, there were all of the signs of a bubble. In '08, there was also different signs of a bubble. And in 2020, there started to be signs of another bubble. And so look, from my generational work, I tell you that cycles happen every 20 years. I'm not a trader and I'm not an economist, and way more about this in terms of economic cycles. But from my point of view, we are not just at an economic cycle, but we are at a generational cycle. And what is the most striking to me about what's happening now and what's happened in the early 2000s, and which is different from '08, is that we are in a generational cycle in addition to an economic one. And that is something I am fascinated by, how I don't hear a lot of discussion about that. And as you know, in the early 2000s, it was that Gen X was coming on the scene. We were coming of age, and generations were turning over then as they are now.
It is fascinating. It really is fascinating. I mean, I came into the industry right after the dot-com crash, and I don't know. I mean, I read this thing once that if you look at generations of people, of investors and people who work in finance, that their earliest experiences really paint how they view the world, for the rest of their career. So if you were, if you came up in the global financial crisis and it really, was your first view of the market, then you're always going to see another global financial crisis coming. If you came during inflation, people from the 70s keep talking about inflation. It's like, we have these biases because we're so impressionable at the time, and our opinions and views of the markets aren't fully formed, and we experience these things, and they're so, in such a real way. Like, we're not yet jaded and just passive about how we're looking at things. Like, they really impact us. And the market is so cyclical that we see these patterns and we see these things emerge. And, you kind of have your tentacles out for the ones that you've, really been impacted by, and you can see them, and you can see parts of them in different eras and different cycles. And to me, it's just an amazing thing. I mean, I just always loved the markets. To me, there's beauty and art and mathematics. I mean, everything. To me, the markets are an amazing thing and a living, breathing thing. And, when you talk about like the dot-com crash and then seeing, echoes of that now and all that, like, to me, it's like, it's a very, I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, but it's like the way somebody who truly appreciates art would look at a Picasso and find such beauty. And I walk by in a museum, look at it, and be like, all right, that's cool, and then move on to the next. I just don't have an appreciation for it. But these things with the market, to me, are just so real and impactful. And so I wouldn't feel bad that you've lived through different cycles and that you see it. I think it's great. I think it's wisdom, and it's an appreciation for it.
It's resonant, and of course, there are winners and losers in it, right? I mean, you think about, I love the art of storytelling. I'm going to tell you that I, as a single woman with no family money whatsoever, I have like the opposite of family money. I have negative family money. I bought a house in San Francisco in 2000. I was supposed to close escrow on 9/11 in 2001. Yeah. And I was doing an 80-10-10, and I never could have imagined that I would have been able to afford a house in that era by myself with absolutely no help from anyone. Okay. So that's 2001. And San Francisco real estate is and was not COVID different, is nuts. Okay. So I sold that house and bought another house anyway over the next few years, and made a ton of money for a young, woman in my early 30s. Are you ready for this, Phil? What did I do? I bought a house at the top of the market in LA during the bust in 08, 09. And at this point now, I'm married, but we lost every dime on the bust that I made in the boom. And so we just laugh about it now because it is what it is. But, people that have lived through cycles, you win some and you lose some. And maybe some people are always winning. I guess that's just not my narrative. That's not the story that I get to tell. But I literally made crazy money in the first boom of after '01, and then lost every dime on the house that we had in LA. And that's just how it goes.
Well, you bounced back pretty well. And I want to go back over what we were talking about in the beginning about disruption and banks. How would you describe, I mean, part of me feels like, well, if a bank wants to add, if they want to connect with Gen Z and they want to add better technology, they can build an app and they can, maybe buy a small company that's connecting. But it's more than that. And you've described it as more than that. It's a transformation from the inside out. What does that mean exactly? How would, if the CEO of a major bank is listening and they're like, I really want to address this. Like, what is it, like, drilling into how they can be impactful and make those changes? Like what does that mean in a more tangible way?
So transformation at a large firm is extremely difficult. 70% of IT projects fail, and there are hundreds of millions of dollars of failed technology projects from the inside out. What I'm fascinated by most recently is how difficult it is. I think people think this is easy, right? Either technology firms have to transform, and why is that so hard? And then, or they can just buy fintech, and why is that so hard? And it really, I think, is, why does somebody who is born in one culture not necessarily just ultimately easily acclimate to a very different culture? If they have a lot in common, why is it not just easy? And it's really rooted in very different histories. And I think that history is really underappreciated. So if we think about the way that the large firms and even the mid-sized firms, I guess I'm saying, have grown up, is through mergers and acquisitions over decades, that every single time business executives have to make decisions, and IT executives have to make decisions about really difficult things like, am I going to keep this system, retire that system? Am I going to knock all those users off that platform, or am I just going to keep them and hope to keep the ball rolling? So what's happened over decades is that all of these firms, and I mean everyone from Citibank to JP Morgan to Wells Fargo to even the mid-sized firms, have grown up over decades through mergers and acquisitions. And every single time they have done that, most have accumulated technical debt that they have not dealt with. And they're also dealing with regulations and then the added layer of cybersecurity requirements that are coming at them. Then we had Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley and whatever compliance thing you can imagine. And I think you've got that side of it. Then you have the fintech side, which is where you have somebody, Gen X, millennial, going, oh my God, this is a gap. This is something that we need. And I'm going to grow it like Amazon grew their business with, it's based in the cloud and it's, scalable and it has an API and it does all of these amazing things. And then I'm going to either try to get customers for it or I'm going to sell it to a bank. Well, getting the customers, I think we realize, besides Robinhood, is hard. And selling it is not easy because banks are trying to fit it into their mainframe. So you really have two people, one talking apples, one talking oranges, and really struggling to come together. I think the falling apart of the Plaid Visa deal is a good example of where, we were all rooting for a big win between, what I call captives and fintech. And that, of course, that fell apart. So to answer your question, and I am proud of the fact that I have, the one thing I'm the most proud of, to be honest, is that I have a body of work because I had an amazing team that landed projects that were transformational for clients and team members. And what I would say to anyone listening to this is that you have to recognize that you can't eat an elephant in one bite. You need to create projects that are actually landable. You need people that are willing to tell the truth about where a project is. And you need to do it in a way that gets you wins along the way rather than what's happened in the industry, which is where they say, I'm going to re-platform a mainframe and go behind a curtain and hope that the 438 surround systems that I need to re-platform at the same time is all successful, and I'm going to unveil it. Ta-da. And by the way, I just want to say this, Phil, because I know it's maybe not all of your users that are into technology like this, but people have thought that agile would be the answer. And agile is not actually the answer either, because you've got many banks that are using the waterfall style of technology, bringing technology to bear, leaning into agile, and then neither working, right? So I do think that that's also a reason why so many projects are failing in the industry. And there is a happy medium of both, but you have to not eat the elephant in one bite. And you need people that know the business who can help you get there in a way that they're telling you the truth. So,
yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think maybe another to add to that, it would be authenticity and the importance of authenticity, which, really manifests itself, I think, in a number of ways on, we talked about on social media, but also with different generations. And you talk about, from the inside out, an organization implementing something from the inside out. I think authenticity is the hardest thing, by definition, the hardest thing to fake. So,
no, I do. And if I could just say something about that, I feel like our business, and you've been around long enough to know, I think our business has suffered for a long time of people with big egos who either can't handle the truth or don't want to know the truth, or people on the other side that are too intimidated or afraid to tell the truth. And maybe the person on the other end is willing to hear the truth, but they're surrounded by people who are too afraid to tell it. And, that really goes back to my, I love Gen Z. I think they're awesome. And I think Gen Z has grown up in a way that they will be more willing to be authentic in that regard. And I think your kids are similarly aged to mine. They can't be stopped. And I think that's awesome. So, go Gen Z.
I asked this of all of my guests, which is, tell me about an obstacle that you've had either in your personal life or your career that you've either found a way to work around or that you just persisted right through.
I have dyscalculia. It's most easily described as math dyslexia. I have a fairly severe form of it. I was not diagnosed until my mid-20s, but I started getting it, or I started manifesting itself at least when I was in third grade. And it is not a very well understood learning disability. It affects between 11 and 16% of the population. So you can imagine growing up in the 70s and 80s where not very much political correctness existed then, and certainly not very much awareness of maybe people needed other assistance in learning systems existed. And I had a lot of very difficult nights where a frustrated adult, well-meaning frustrated adult, was yelling at me. And in my inner ear, I'll just tell you, Phil, it was, damn it, Julia, you're not an idiot. Why don't you just do this, as they stab a piece of paper with a math problem on it. And, that person could not have understood that there was no way for my brain to do that math problem in the way that I was being informed of how to do math. So the fact that that little girl grew up to have a successful career in finance and technology, both fields that require a great deal of quantitative reasoning, I think is a triumph. And the triumph that I attribute it to is that in my early to mid 20s, I was fortunate to meet someone who recognized that I had a skill set, and that skill set was translating very difficult, complex subjects into English. And he also convinced me that doing that job was also a meaningful way to make money. So I've always in my career tried to stay close to that because I think it's easy as, at one point I managed over 400 people. I think it's easy as you get more and more senior and more, kind of in the clouds with your head. You just think you don't have to do anything that kind of grounds you. And I, really disagree. I have always deliberately tried to stay close to that notion that do what you're good at problem solving. And when I look back at the arc of my career, that is absolutely what has given me any kind of measurable success. So that's one. And then the other thing I talk about, you talked about authenticity, which I love. The other thing I talk about is vulnerability. So I was in my mid-20s when I was finally diagnosed. And at that point, I had enough kind of innate confidence in who I was to never show up in a room pretending that I was a math wizard. And I started trading my communication skills with finance for finance help. And they won and I won, and teamwork makes the dream work. So, I hope someone listening to this who kind of wonders, is it okay to be vulnerable in the workplace? It is. And I hope they're inspired to know that being different and leaning into those differences isn't just some crazy politically correct thing, but it really made a difference, a material difference in my life.
I love that. I think that's a perfect place to leave it off. Thank you, Julia. Where can people follow more of what you're writing and catch what you're working on next?
So I'm figuring all that out still, but I am on Twitter and my DMs are open. And I'm also on LinkedIn. I use the middle initial C in most places. So happy to have a conversation with anybody who wants to chat further.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the audience for your time and attention. Please drop a rating or a review if you are so inclined, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you for listening to the Phil Bach Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to drop a review. This show was published for entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Please contact a licensed professional before making any investments. Some of the securities discussed on the show may be owned by its participants. Opinions expressed on the show may not reflect those of their employers. Stay hungry and stay foolish.